Last week we began a study on the Beatitudes, and we looked at, as kind of an introduction to the Beatitudes, Eastern and Western thinking. Western thinking is what we are a part of. It came a lot from the Greeks. It has to do with logic. It has to do with order. It has to do with learning things. Whereas the Eastern thinking is much more focused on being, on pictures, on becoming like their teacher. And we talked about that. And that's important as we look at discipleship, to realize that what Jesus thought of as discipleship and what his apostles and disciples thought of as discipleship was being like him. And I think that we understand that as Christians, that that's what we are to aspire to become more and more like Christ. Disciplines, which we're going to be talking about today, spiritual disciplines, are a way of becoming more like Christ, disconnecting from the world. A really good book is Spirit of the Disciplines by Dallas Willard. I got my fingers over that. It, as a subtitle, it's Understanding How God Changes Lives. And what he talks about is disciplines are not something that earns us salvation, is meritorious in any way. But it is something that puts us in a position when we do these disciplines to be closer to God and to become, have that opportunity as we behold Christ to be transformed into his image and to live as Jesus lived. He says of discipline, a discipline for the spiritual life is when all the dust of history is blown away, nothing but an activity undertaken to bring us into more effective cooperation with Christ and his kingdom. Now, as I go through some of these spiritual disciplines, some of them I'm sure you're already involved in, some of them maybe you haven't thought about before. But he breaks this up into two classifications. He says disciplines of abstinence, which keep us away from the world or help us to get away from the world, and disciplines of engagement, which help us to engage with God. But I'm going to use two different terms. Disciplines of disengagement, disengaging from the world. We still have to be in the world, but ways that we can separate ourselves and not be controlled by the world. And disciplines of participation, participating with God. That's a Bible word. Koinonia is a word that means fellowship or participation. And 2 Peter talks about participating with God. And so this is how we can connect with Christ and with his spiritual kingdom. So the list that I'm giving, most of them are from Dallas Willard's book, but some of them I've added, and you'll probably kind of guess which ones I've added. In disciplines of disengagement, the first one is solitude. Having quiet time away from human beings, undistracted by requirements from other things, interruptions, giving us undistracted time to be with God. It's a time in the wilderness. It's the solitude that helps us to develop freedom from people and behaviors. In therapy, we talk about codependence. Some people have to be around people and get their approval for everything in their life. And that keeps us from being close to God because we don't depend on God, we depend on other people. Now, we can look at Jesus' life and we can see that he did this a lot of times. He would get up in the morning to pray, which is another one of the disciplines, but he would get along, he'd go off on his own. I think that walking on the water was a way to not be distracted by anybody. So there's a lot of different things that he did. Got away with his apostles. So we have, as an example of Jesus taking that, he was in the desert for 40 days. In fact, Elijah and Moses all spent time in the desert. David spent time in the desert. Second one on this of disciplines of disengagement is silence. We live in a noisy world, and it's closing ourselves off from sounds, noise, music, words. I've seen people up at ACU who are studying with earphones, always having to have some kind of sound, the TV on or something like that. And we can't think. Our brain takes that in. People go to sleep, and you don't sleep well if you have sounds going on in the background. So we see that Jesus also took this time of silence. Being in the desert was a very, very quiet place. It's called a desert because it's deserted. There may be some lizards, there may be some scorpions, there may be little insects, but there aren't hardly any birds even. It's very quiet, just the breeze. And we need to have time away from the world, time away from all these sounds in order to think. Another is simplicity. The discipline of simplicity is detaching from the complexities of life, in which the world tells us that we must be involved in order to be happy. With this coronavirus, we've learned that, and for some of us it's very, very difficult to have all this quietness and have all this simplicity. We're used to rushing here and there. And so it's a way of getting away from our uncomplicated lives and not being controlled by that. So you can see that these are all things that cut us loose from that. Jesus told his disciples to travel light, in their taking of the gospel. He told the 70 the same thing. Frugality is another discipline. It's abstaining from using material things to gratify desires like status or glamour or luxury. Frugality frees us to be around people more and to help people more. But its primary purpose is to disconnect us from that which hooks us to the world's values. The world has really messed up values, and we don't need to be a part of that. So we hold possessions in open hands. You can hold so much more in an open hand than in a clenched fist. So Jesus taught us that we cannot serve God in money. We have to make a choice. The rich young ruler was told to sell all he had and give it to the poor because Jesus knew how that had a control over him, and that's what he needed. You and I probably need something else, or maybe we do need to let go of those things. But when it comes to the things we have, we need to realize they're gifts of God. And if they're needed for something else, we let them go. We don't hold to them and keep them to ourselves. Another discipline of disengagement is chastity. It's not putting sexuality at the center of our lives. In this world, that seems to be something that is so important to people. And we're not to even put sexuality at the center of our lives in our marriages. Now, that doesn't mean that sexuality isn't a part of marriage. But I've seen in counseling couples who put too much emphasis on sexuality. They're obsessed by it. They have almost a pornographic view of it. And it's not to be the center of life. There's other things. The word eros, which has to do with sexual love, is not even in the Bible. And so there are priorities. It's being able to connect with people without sexual involvement and without sexual thoughts. Jesus talked about that. And, not to lust. So these are principles that Jesus taught and are important. Paul taught about this, spoke about this many times in the scriptures. This is not the most important thing in life. Another one, which I think is a really important one, is secrecy. And Jesus talks about that in the Sermon on the Mount. It's refraining from telling others about the good things that we do, and make an effort so that people will not readily see the good that we are doing. Now, that seems to be counter to the way the world looks at things. If we do something good, if we help someone, people need to know about it. But, I've used this illustration. Imagine that you need $10,000. And someone says, I'd like to give you $10,000. And you didn't know how you were going to get it. You're just so grateful to this person. And they say, I'll be around at 5 o'clock to give you this check. And so you're very excited. They come knocking on your door. You notice out front that there are these vans from K-Texas and K-Tab, and you see reporters out there, talking to a camera. And this person comes up to you, and they've got this gigantic check, with your name on it. And like one of those, fundraisers, they give you this check, present it so that everyone can take pictures of you. Well, I know I would be grateful for the $10,000, but I'd know that also the motives of that person were to be seen by people. The Jews use a term, it's called a mitzvah, which means secrecy, which means blessing. And it's a gift that is done in secret. They usually on the Day of Atonement each year will, take some groceries over to a widow. They knock on the door and they run. And it doesn't count if the widow sees them. It doesn't count if they tell someone about it. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, don't do your good deeds, your mitzvahs, in order to be seen by men. Now, that's a Greek word. It's not mitzvah. But that's a concept. And so doing things just for the goodness of it in order to be seen by God. Jesus would heal someone and he'd say, don't tell anyone about this. So we're being like Christ when we do those things. Have you ever seen those videos on YouTube where you have old preacher and he goes up to a homeless man and he gives him some money? I remember watching this one, and the homeless man says, sit right here. And he goes off camera, comes back with a meal and shares it with the minister. And at first I was kind of saying, wow, that is really, really sweet. Then I realized this minister is mic'd and someone is recording this from across the street. That's not a mitzvah. And so secrecy is a very, very important thing. And it's a good habit because then you're just doing it. And if someone, you can't always keep things secret. But if someone does discover it, they know that you weren't doing it in order to be seen by people. So, maybe there's a neighbor in your, that you can send a thank you card or I appreciate you and not even sign it. And then the person can kind of suspect everyone for that. So you make the world better in that. Another is fasting, abstaining from necessary things for a period of time to lessen their control on us. And this is very easy to incorporate into our daily lives. Not eating after your evening meal, not snacking, letting yourself be hungry by the time you wake up in the morning. These are some things that if you eat at 6 and you don't eat breakfast until 6, that's a fast of 12 hours. And so you'll feel the hunger and you'll understand that we need to be grateful for what God has done. Your prayer with your breakfast will be thank you for, I know some people don't have this breakfast. And so fasting is important. Jesus taught about fasting in Matthew 6 too. also. He says, when you fast. He didn't say if you fast. He said when you fast. And then one that is not in Dillard's book, and that's fasting from electronics. And this is one I need to do. TVs, cell phones, computers, video games, and things like that. They're not life and death necessities, but they have become important things in our lives, in our business. It's not throwing them away, but it's turning them off and making ourselves unavailable to other people. Whether you're a teenager or an adult, there's a lot of adults that are just as addicted to this as teenagers. But having times when you're not on those things, not watching TV to go to sleep, having quiet times, then you're going to have more time to study God's Word. And this is another important way of disconnecting from the world. So one of the things that, as I was thinking about how to illustrate this, it's the idea that we are tied to the world. And so it's kind of like, as we do these disciplines, we are cutting those lines of connection to the world so that we can now be free to go with God and become more of what we were supposed to be. So what are disciplines of participation? Things that draw us closer to God? Well, first of all is study. Reading God's Word. Letting Him communicate with us. Now, Jesus knew God's Word. We talked about how well, like as a young man, as a 12-year-old, he was asking questions of these rabbis in the temple. So Jesus knew the Word. And probably all of the people that I'm speaking to make this a part of their lives. This is a study right now. But have study on your own too. Prayer is another. Communicating with God. Not focusing on always asking for things, but thanking God for what He's done for us. Discussing things with Him. Talking with Him like a friend. If you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, you see that he's, Tevye is someone who is constantly talking with God, arguing with God. You look at the Bible and you see some of the people that were closest to God complained to God. That's a Jewish Eastern way of looking at things. And so Job complained to God. But God said he was a righteous man. David, a man after God's own heart. You look at the Psalms, and he complained a lot about things. Jeremiah. It's almost important part of being a Christian and being close to God in order to have a normal relationship with Him, not a distant relationship. Memorization. Dallas Willard says that he would say that this is one of the most important disciplines of participation. Memorizing. Getting God's Word inside us so that we can think about it and carry it around with us. Not just little verses. Sometimes we memorize verses like they're bumper stickers. It's memorizing whole passages. In a few weeks, we're going to go over each week the Beatitudes. That's a good thing to have in your mind. You can memorize the whole Sermon on the Mount. Just imagine what that's like to be able to carry that around with you. Meditation is another thing. Considering what we've learned. Applying the things to our own lives. Thinking about the day and how God has been a part of it and how we've lived it. It's integrating into our mind, and it can include reading the Bible, certainly, and meditating on that, or also good spiritual books. Service is another discipline of participation. Jesus came to seek and save the lost, and he helped people. And so service is something that it's practicing agape love. And then the last one, and I'd like to talk just about this for a little bit, is spiritual journaling. I'm a journaler, and one of the things, I guess, I have a journal all the time that I'm writing in, and I have a pen that, I don't have it here, but I have a certain kind of pen that I use for my journaling, and it's a real fine point because my handwriting's not very neat, and it looks neater if it's fine point for me. But this is a wonderful discipline to get into, and I'm going to try to have a downloadable PDF for you that you can use to get started on spiritual journaling. But God has so much to teach us, and it's beyond our minds to hold all these things in our brain. So we can use journals to capture the many insights, understandings, comments of other people, things that you hear in the sermon from Chris that you don't want to forget. To carry a journal with you. This is one that has a little elastic thing that will hold it together, and it's got a little pocket so that you can put cards in here, and I put kind of memorization cards in there. So journaling can be a really, really helpful thing, and then at other times we can share those things, the things that we have learned, maybe in a class, or I was thinking about this the other day, or I noticed this quote and this was really helpful to me. So all of these things are really, really important. Remember, of cutting ourselves loose from this world, those things of disengaging from this world in order to participate with God. And these are not things that make us holy on their own. They are things that put us in a position where we're now free we're not tied to the world so much. Or we realize when we are getting tied, we get the scissors out again and clip those things on a daily basis. And then we're free to follow Jesus and become like him, like Peter. I've thought some time, and I like to just kind of end with this, of what would happen if Jesus came to my office. And I've just finished with a client, and I've got some more clients coming. And he says, "Come, follow me. I think you can become like me." Would I be like the person who said, well, first I've got to do this? Or would I be like Peter, James, and John, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, who immediately left the nets and that big pile of fish and followed Jesus? I don't know. I hope, if I'm tied to this world, it's going to be harder for me to get up and follow Jesus. And so think about that, and think about if Jesus interrupted your day when you were doing something. Would you be someone, first let me do this? Or would you get up and follow him? We'll understand that better, as we participate in these disciplines. Hope this was helpful for you.